Welcome dear students. Today our topic is New Institutionalism. Firstly, we will try to understand what is New Institutional Approach. Then we will try to focus on how norms and values embodied in political institutions shape the behavior of individuals. Then we will try to highlight the main differences between old and new institutionalisms. To discuss three different analytical approaches, each of which calls itself a new institutionalism. To see how different variants of new institutionalism seek to elucidate the role that institutions play in determining social and political outcomes. Political science emerged late as an independent discipline as compared to other areas in social sciences. During its formative years, the study of political institutions was the pivot around which the entire discipline revolved. The in-depth study of formal government institutions and legal norms is a distinguishing characteristics of political science. However, for a time, institutions as March and Olsen remark receded from the position they held in the earlier theories of political scientists. Its revival came with a larger analytical framework which provided a broad rather than a specific outline. Two important characteristics of an institution are a long-standing observation of rules and conventions, followed by orderly organized practices in which individual players play a subordinate role, and the enduring institution is insulated from A. individual expectations and B. the changing external environment. The emphasis is on appropriate behavior played out through rational actions for a long time. For instance, British practice of once a speaker, always a speaker. Over a period of time, institutional structures develop codes of behavior and common motivations, while stressing predictable behavior leads to a justification of a legitimate behavioral pattern. March and Olsen term such a development prescriptive rules of appropriateness. Until the 1950s, the study of politics had largely involved the study of institutions. This traditional or old institutionalism focused on the rules, procedures and formal organization of government and employed methods akin to those used in the study of law and history. The advent of the behavioral revolution, combined with growing concerns about its unreflective and essentially descriptive methods, which sometimes threaten to reduce politics to a collection of organizational rules and structures, led to institutionalism being marginalized during the 1960s and 1970s. However, interest in it was revived from the 1980s onward by the emergence of what was called New Institutionalism. While remaining faithful to the core institutionalist belief that institutions matter, in the sense that political structures are thought to shape political behavior, New Institutionalism has revised our understanding of what constitutes an institution in a number of respects. The scholars can achieve greater analytical leverage by beginning with institutions rather than individuals. For the New Institutionalists, although institution is the core area of political analysis, a wide divergence exists amongst them with regard to its contents. An institution evolves and develops its own strength and plays an autonomous role in the political sphere. The basic purpose of institutionalism is a normative concern with improving the political system. Institutionalism develops by interacting, learning and deviating from rational choice theory and political culture theories. Political institutions are no longer equated with political organizations. They are thought of not as things but as sets of rules which guide or constrain the behavior of individual actors. These rules, moreover, are as likely to be informal as formal, policy-making processes sometimes being shaped more by unwritten conventions or understandings than by formal arrangements. Apart from anything else, this can help to explain why institutions are often difficult to reform, transform or replace. Finally, rather than viewing institutions as independent entities, in which case they exist almost outside of time and space, New Institutionalists emphasize that institutions are embedded in a particular normative and historical context. Thus, just as actors within an institutional setting are socialized to accept key rules and procedures, the institution itself operates within a larger and more fundamental body of assumptions and practices. The phrase New Institutionalism was coined by J. G. March and J. P. Olson in their groundbreaking work, The New Institutionalism, Organizational Factors in Political Life, which was published in 1984, to denote an approach to politics which holds that behavior is fundamentally molded by the institutions it is embedded in. They argued that studying individual behavior without examining institutional constraints on that behavior was giving a skewed understanding of political reality. Their call to bring the institutions back in its therefore a part of the post-behavioral approach that had come to prominence. The new institutional approach combined the interests of traditional scholars in studying formal institutional rules and structures with the focus of behavioralist scholars on examining the actions of political actors is different from the earlier institutional approach in a broadening the meaning of institutions to include not only formal rules and structures, but also informal conventions and coalitions that shape political conduct. B. Taking a critical look at the way in which political institutions embody values and power relationships. C. In rejecting the determinism of earlier approaches and accepting that while institutions may constrain individual conduct, they are also human creations which change and evolve through the agency of actors. Since the 1990s, new institutionalists have been using a variety of methodological approaches to understand how norms, rules, cultures, and structures constrain and influence individuals within a political institution. While there are a number of strands of new institutionalism, March and Olson accept the fact that a full-blown theory of political institutions is not available, which has encountered criticism and constant process of elaboration is continuously developing. There is no unified body of thought. At least 3 analytical approaches have emerged over the years, each of which calls itself new institutionalism. These are historical institutionalism, sociological institutionalism, and rational choice institutionalism. All of these approaches developed in reaction to the behavioral perspective that were influential during the 1960s and 1970s, and all seek to elucidate the role that institutions play in the determination of social and political outcomes. Now, dear students, let's do a comparative analysis of old institutionalism and new institutionalism. Now, study institutions as distinct autonomous political entities. That's old institutionalism. New institutionalism study institution in relation to individual behavior and social structure and other institutions. Old institutionalism that focus on formal, legal, descriptive, normative, philosophical, historical. Now, new institutionalism that focus on analytical, explanatory, and empirical. Old institutionalism that confined mostly to studying liberal, democratic institutions of West, ethnocentric. New institutionalism, there's much wider geographical separate attempt to study institutions of overall socio-economic context. In old institutionalism, considered as traditional approach to comparative politics, new institutionalism, more interdisciplinary. Old institutionalism aims at inductive reasoning, and new institutionalism that aims at deductive reasoning. In old institutionalism, no systematic cross-country or cross-cultural comparison is done. In new institutionalism, that has much more comparative focus. Now, dear students, let's have a look on the theoretical foundation. With the advent of behavioral revolution, scholars in political science witnessed a paradigm shift in their occupation and concern with formal and legal institutions. This approach ignored the important ingredients of political life, like non-political attributes of governmental institutions. The behavioralists wanted to catch or comprehend political behavior scientifically and to understand the real working of political process. March and Olsen, however, argue in favor of reassessment of political institutions, that is, to measure their independent and endurable implications. To achieve this, they reject first contextualism, politics purely as society's reflection, and reductionism, which means macro aggregation of individual players, and then instrumentalism and the reduction of politics to only policy making and the allocation of resources. Then the perception that political action is solely determined by calculating self-interested behavior, and finally the standard equilibrium models as history. Rejecting all these methodologies, they proposed that political order is created by a collection of institutions that fit more or less into a coherent system. These patterns are not static, as they change over time and are structured not on the basis of one set of principles, but on different principles. Politics is played not in a vacuum, but in a social construction, which is knowledge, and has two crucial characteristics, that is, anticipation and acceptance. This framework is important as, by virtue of the rules and practices, political institutions define basic rights and duties, shape or regulate our advantages, burdens and life chances are allocated in society, and create authority to settle and resolve conflicts. New institutionalism identifies the rules, norms, practices and relationships that influences patterns of behavior in politics and policy making. Institution once described policy making organizations such as legislatures, executives and judiciary. Now, it describes the formal and informal rules that guide action. Institutions are not the buildings or arenas within which people make policy. They are the rules of behavior that influence how they make it. For instance, US federal model and its constitution sets out the rules governing the separation of powers between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, and guarantees a degree of subnational policy making autonomy. One can compare these rules with those of other political systems, such as the Westminster model, which has an executive within the legislature and less automatic subnational autonomy. Moreover, particular formal rules may allow comparisons of policy making styles, the way governments make and implement policy. For example, Lippard differentiates between the styles in majoritarian systems with first past the post electoral rules and consensus democracies which use proportional representation. The values of an institution are many. A. It injects order into social relations. B. It minimizes flexibility in individual behavior. And C. It avoids one-sided and selfish pursuit of self-interests. This basic Weberian principle compels individuals to follow general principles and rules and develops a logic of appropriateness. Legitimacy becomes a common denominator. Institutions do not need to be static, nor is their emergence inevitable. The new institutionalists like March and Olsen do not project any ideal type of institution, thus remained careful by just try to optimize rather than reach an optimal point. They admit that institutions are slow to adapt to change in the environment. They emphasize on an orderly change and normality with appropriate behavior. As appropriate procedure leads to appropriate behavior. New institutionalists' focus is on rules and norms and focus both on formal and informal institutions. New institutionalism is also more theoretical and is interested in the process of institutional change. They argued that studying individual political behavior without examining institutional constraints on that behavior was giving a skewed understanding of political reality. Their call to bring the institutions back in is therefore a part of the post-behavioral approach that had come to prominence. Now, since the 1990s, new institutionalists have been using a variety of methodological approaches to understand how norms, rules, cultures, and structures constrain and influence individuals within a political institution. While there are a number of strands of new institutionalism, however, three schools provide an alternative conception of institutions relevant for comparative politics. Now, dear students, let's see the key variants or strands of new institutionalism. Firstly, historical institutionalism. Historical institutionalism developed in response to the group theories of politics and structural functionalism, prominent in political science during the 1960s and 1970s. It borrowed from both approaches but sought to go beyond them. From group theory, historical institutionalists accepted the contention that conflict among rival groups for scarce resources lies at the heart of politics, but they sought better explanations for the distinctiveness of national political outcomes and for the inequalities that mark these outcomes. They built on an older tradition in political science that assigned importance to formal political institutions, but they developed a more expansive conception both of which institutions matter and of how they matter. Historical institutionalism treats institutions as the formal rules, compliance procedures and standard operating procedures that structure conflict or structure and shape behavior and outcomes. The historical institutionalists were also influenced by the way in which structural functionalists saw the polity as an overall system of interacting parts. They accepted this contention but reacted against the tendency of many structural functionalists to view the social, psychological or cultural traits of individuals as the parameters driving much of systems operation. The key terms in the variant are historical contingency, path dependence and critical juncture. Historical contingency refers to the extent to which events and decisions made in the past contributed to the formation of institutions that influence current practices. Path dependence suggests that when a commitment to an institution has been established and resources devoted to it, over time it produces increasing returns and it becomes increasingly costly to choose a different path. Therefore, institutions and the practices they encourage may remain stable for long period of time. A critical juncture is the point at which certain event and decisions led to the introduction of or major change to an institution. The timing of these decisions is crucial because it may be the order of events that sets an institution on its path. Path dependence suggests initial unpredictability but subsequent inertia, as relatively small events and actions have large and enduring effects on institutions. It may suggest a reproduction mechanism, as some decisions close off other options and established organizations serve to uphold their own rules. This aspect of historical institutionalism contributes to a distinct literature called policy feedback theory, PFT. The wider lesson is that significant institutional differences are likely to develop in each country because a different set of initial conditions produce a different set of actions and events which have a cumulative effect and set institutional development on a different path. Therefore, to help give a full explanation for current institutional and policy differences between countries, we should look to the past to establish how and why they developed. Regarding the question of how institutions affect the behavior of individuals, historical institutionalists use two approaches: the calculus and cultural approaches. The calculus approach emphasizes the fact that individuals seek to maximize their goals through their preference and act strategically in pursuit of those goals. The institutions affect human behavior mainly by providing information, rules, and norms to actors, thereby decreasing the level of uncertainty about the behavior of other actors. The cultural approach argues that human behavior is bound by individuals' worldview, which views the individual not as utility maximizers but as satisficers, whose actions are dependent on context rather than on strategic calculation. In nutshell, historical institutionalists tend to conceptualize the relationship between institutions and individual behavior. B. They emphasize the asymmetries of power associated with the operation and development of institutions. C. They tend to have a view of institutional development that emphasize the path dependence and unintended consequences. D. They are concerned with the role of institutions in political life, but do not insist that institutions are only casual factor in politics, accept the contribution that other factors like ideas can make to political outcomes. Now let's have a look on rational choice institutionalism. Rules and incentives lie at the core of rational choice institutionalism. Initially, rational choice institutionalism arose from the study of American congressional behavior. In large measure, it was inspired by the observation of a significant paradox. If conventional rational choice postulates are correct, it should be difficult to secure stable majorities for legislation in the US Congress, where the multiple preference orderings of legislators and multi-dimensional character of issues should lead to rapid cycling from one bill to another as new majorities appear to overturn any bill that is passed. However, congressional outcomes actually show considerable stability. In the late 1970s, rational choice analysts began to ask, how can this discrepancy be explained? For an answer, they turn to institutions. As institutions solve many of the collective action problems that legislators habitually confront, many argued that stable majorities could be found for legislation because of the way in which the rules of procedure and committees of Congress structure the choices and information available to its members. It focuses on explaining how the rules of Congress affect the behavior of legislators and why they arise, with an emphasis on the congressional committee system and the relationship between Congress and regulatory agencies. Rational choice institutionalists have also turned their attention to variety of other phenomena, including cross-national coalition behavior, the development of political institutions, and the intensity of ethnic conflict. This approach is used by some scholars to analyze democratic transition in some countries in game theoretical terms, as well as to explain the rise and fall of international regimes and implications of institutional reforms in the European Union. First, rational choice institutionalists employ a characteristic set of behavioral assumptions. They posit that the relevant actors have a fixed set of preferences or tastes, behave entirely instrumentally so as to maximize the attainment of these preferences, and do so in a highly strategic manner that presumes extensive calculations. Secondly, they tend to see politics as a series of collective action dilemmas which can be defined as instances when individuals acting to maximize the attainment of their own preferences are likely to produce an outcome that is collectively suboptimal. Problems like prisoner's dilemma, the tragedy of commons are some examples. Thirdly, the great contribution of rational choice institutionalism has been to emphasize the role of strategic interaction in the determination of political outcomes. They postulate that an actor's behavior is likely to be driven not by personal historical forces but by a strategic calculus, and that this calculus will be deeply affected by the actor's expectations about how others are likely to behave as well. Finally, this approach also tries to explain how institutions originate by assuming that the actors create the institutions in order to realize their value, which is most often conceptualized in terms of gains from cooperation. Now, dear students, let's have a look on sociological institutionalism. It's also referred as cultural or normative institutionalism and draws heavily on the works of Durkheim and Weber, as its concern is with the forms of social control that collective institutions exert on individual action. It developed in the field of sociology within the subfield of organizational theory. It also draws on the sociological study of organizations, particularly the works of Philip Selznick, March, and Olsen, considered the founders of new institutionalism, are sociological institutionalists as they define institutions as a relatively enduring collection of rules and organized practices. Norms and culture are the key factors for this school. It conceptualizes institutions as providing sets of norms and rules that shape the individual behavior. The basis of institutions are exogenous, as the history and norms of a political order are integrated within it. No single political actor can create them. Institutions have their own independence and autonomy which over a period of time influence the players' preferences, perceptions and identities. With rules and routines, appropriate and predictable behavior emerges. Duty and obligations overtake rational self-interest. Sociological institutionalism underlines the importance of values and norms in constituting institutions and in socializing individuals into conformity through what March and Olson call the logic of appropriateness. It's argued by this school that institutions themselves set the process of change not through conscious design but through significant social, cultural or political change. They change in an indeterminate manner. Scholars like Edward Said developed the geological view, comparing institutions to coral reefs and show accretions. However, sociological institutionalism does not explain how institutions originate. Now, dear students, let's conclude. It is interesting to see that political science today is confronted with not one but three new institutionalisms. The challenge before us is to figure out not which one of these is most appropriate, but to find out the common ground between the three. One of the major criticisms leveled against the institutionalism and new institutionalism is that it tends to overemphasize the role of institutions, whether formal or informal, and give lesser importance to the conflicts and interests that are in many ways the basis of politics in many societies. Nevertheless, new institutionalism and its different variants taken together can provide insights into the functioning of politics in many societies. So, the need of the hour is more open and intense interchange among them. Moreover, if the most extreme assumptions of each school's theoretical positions are relaxed, they share a great deal of common analytical ground on which the insights of one approach might be used to supplement or strengthen those of the another. This was all about the institutionalism. Hope you have understood. Thank you. Have a nice day.